Hey folks, so this is Art History 497X. This is the assignment for today, May 8th. Excuse me. And this is Professor Luce, of course. So I have up the sketch, sort of just picking up from that last video. And so this is the sketch where I have it right now, and I hope this is when I was completely done with it, so I left you off where we just sort of had the body and the head centered, and there was lots of other work to be done. Again, the lines probably were the hardest part because you don't get to cheat with just the one center point and then just tell it width and height. Instead, you have to figure out and be very explicit. Remember, that's one of the things about computation. You have to be very explicit about where the line starts and where it stops. But I hope that in figuring out where your lines started and stopped, I hope you had enough lines that you started to see that as daunting as that task was, there were patterns involved in it. So for instance, if you look at the area that I have called body and legs, you can see in these first two lines, for instance, you're talking, when we're talking about the X direction, so we're starting with the center, we're going to either side of that center by 10, and then our heights are the same, and then because we want those arms to sort of flail out, again, our widths are the same, but we're going to either side instead of 10. Now we're 20, so we know that we've moved 10 points. We've increased basically by 10 pixels the width away from center that we are. And again, our height is the same, but we've removed the negative 20 because that number is basically closer to center. It's right on center, in fact. But you can see that there's a pattern between those two lines, just like there's a pattern between these next two lines here. And in fact, that's the case because of symmetry. My creature was symmetrical. Because of symmetry, those patterns show up. So that's what symmetry looks like in code. And that's one of the things that when you do this enough, you start to understand how concepts like symmetry have their equivalents in code and what that means, right? So you start to see the way those concepts basically translate into this new language. So we'll just give you a look-see, not that it's all that interesting, but this is what my new little creature looks like. And just to show that he's centered, we can go up here and adjust the size of our paper. We'll make that 400 pixels. And our little fella should still be centered when I relaunch it. And sure enough, there he is, bigger paper, but he's still sitting in the center. And that's exactly what we want. So what is it that we've done here? What's so important? What we've done is make everything relational. So before, when you were just using pixels, what you were doing was a lot like drawing. Now granted, it was a very geometric drawing. It was like drawing through graph paper and instructions. It probably seemed like a pretty stupid exercise. The transformation that you've made when you've moved from that original drawing that you did to this moment is that you've made every single one of those objects relational. You know how they relate to one another, and you've turned it into a system. You've basically made it more computational. You've gone up on the order of computational thinking. And so that's a really important point, and it's going to be important as we go forward. So this first, now you have two exercises due. One of them is to tie your little creature here to the mouse so that when I move the mouse around, the creature responds in one way or another. And then the other one is going to be to sort of pick up other color cues and things, playing with some of the other ways variables can make a change. And you can be pretty creative with that. I'm pretty open to what you want to do. So there are two assignments for you, and I'm probably going to end up making more videos than that because there are a couple of points. This one's a really important video so that you understand what it is you've done and why it's hard to move from the previous drawing to this one, because you're defining everything as co-relational. That's really a big deal. But now that we've sort of seen how to do that, and you can see my code and my little creature, hopefully you've had success doing the same thing. And so now I want to talk about that looping idea, right? And there's some interesting things about that. And in those first few pages of the interactivity, we talk about a couple of very important, basically what are loops, more or less. They're kind of interesting loops because, go ahead and stop that, because one of them runs just once, so that's kind of hardly a loop. But the other one is a loop, but it's an infinite loop that doesn't crash the computer, which is nice, right? Considering what the sort of the hassles we had with the last one. So what are these loops we're talking about? Well, one is setup. And some of you have already written to me about the fact that whoops, this bracket, that you are having trouble and you're getting these errors that say things like you're trying to use active and passive at the same time. My guess is the problem is you've probably forgotten this word void, and the book doesn't tell you what's important about that. Basically, as we've talked before, all of these different keywords are functions, right? And functions return something. Now, when we were working in JavaScript, we had to give it that command to return something, but in processing, that return is automatic. When you say void, you tell it you're not going to return something, you're going to do something instead. So I'm not looking for you to create a quantity, I'm looking for you to create an action, right? So that's why that void word is important. Setup makes sense though, right? So setup is just the thing you do before you enact a different kind of function, whatever it is. Draw is the one we're going to be working with. And so when you put something in this void setup area, it's going to run once. It's the setup for everything else. And if you look at it, you notice some really familiar syntax. So you've got your setup command. There are things inside, sort of a setup that says parameters are here, but we don't have to define what those parameters are. But then we have the curly braces again, and if we have an open curly braces, you better believe we need an end curly braces, otherwise we're going to get syntax errors. So here we've got void setup, and so what I'm basically saying with this, and I'm just going to go ahead and hit tab on these two because it helps me read. What we're saying with this is the first thing I want you to do is set the size, and then I'm going to universally say this is how I want my rectangles and ellipses to be drawn. So it's setting this for everything, and that works for me. You could do other things if you wanted. Let's throw in throw in a smooth command. So that's an anti-alias command. So we can throw that in there, and you just need that. Just basically makes all of our ellipses and everything, you know, nice and round. That's a good thing to do. We could throw in perhaps a let's make the background a color, huh? What color should we make it? Let's go 30 red, 150, and let's go 50. Okay, so well, 59 works too, but let's go 50. Okay. So there now we have smooth on, we have background, and so it's going to do all of that before it goes on, right? And so now I want to make the rest of it a loop. So this is sort of a interim. This is one of the things that you needed to do before you could get the mouse thing working. So this is sort of the interim step that I don't explicitly say as part of the assignment. So you've got the void setup done. Now you need to do a void draw command. And now this is the one where we get our infinite loop going. And again, just remember that syntax. Everything else we can leave for now just the way it is. And so we're going to hit the end curly brace on that. And now we're going to make sure we've done those void draw and void setup commands correctly just by running our program. And there we go. Oh, isn't that interesting? So we've managed to fill in all of our ellipses. So let's tell you what, I think we can figure out an easy way to fix that. Let's do a universal fill command as well. I'm not sure why we're getting that all in black, but that's an interesting result. So let's try doing a universal fill command, and we just want it to be white. Let's see how that works. Stop. Interesting. Well, I'm not sure where that error is coming from. I'm sure you all have had problems like this too, so I'm not going to delete this. But I'm just going to let it go, and I think I'm going to do a little debugging here, and then I'll come back and tell you what I ended up figuring out. I think probably there's some problem with my call out there in background, because this really shouldn't be happening this way. Void smooth background fill. Oh, I see what's happening. It's because, So what has happened is, here, where before I was just saying fill the nose and mouth with black, because I've called that, even though it's inside this void draw, it's now a command that's looping with everything. So I need to go through and call, I think right after I run my void draw, I need to call a new fill command. So we're going to do that here. And the reason why it wasn't working up here, actually, you know what I can do instead? I'm just going to take this out, because this is actually the lesson I wanted to tell you next. That's kind of perfect. Understanding the difference between the setup and the draw. So once we figured out why everything was filling in, and that was because I have fill right here, and once that command is given once, that remains the fill, right? And so everything that was being drawn with that black fill. When I put the fill up here in void setup, that was just being run once. But then once we got down to the draw loop, it was being drawn over and over and over again. So basically, we never got back up into the setup to see that fill as white. So let's put it here instead. And we'll just sort of separate that so that we know that's kind of a universal command that's going on within the draw menu. And technically, I prefer to have all of these on tabs so that I can easily see. It's just sort of like, you know, seeing headers and bullet points and things like that. And so since we've got these major commands going on of void setup and void draw, I like to see my code kind of indented so I know this is all being commanded by this sort of first level here. Okay, so let's see if we fixed things. We should have, I think. There we go. Perfect. So there's our little guy now set up in this loop. And I love the fact that that little lesson about fill, which is a really interesting one, showed up kind of organically because I wasn't quite thinking with all of my pistons firing there. It's really normal, and debugging is part of an absolute normal part of coding. The great thing is that the computer executes things so quickly, there's no risk, right? The only risk is that you're not going to be able to debug it later, but really with a little attention, you can do that. The key, of course, is developing that literacy and being able to read what it is you wrote and really understand what you're doing and the way that it works. And so when I took a little time to look through here, I did find that fill command, and I realized that it was that fill command that was looping, creating everything sort of as black. But okay, so that is the first step that you need to do, is get yourself in a properly functioning setup and draw loop. And once you do that, you can move forward. All right, thanks so much.